As we continue on the Megacast, talking about the situation at Michigan State University following the mass shooting on Monday night, we're joined now by someone who is directly associated with Michigan State University, a professor of criminal justice at Michigan State University, and also the board chairperson for the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. Dr. Chris Smith joins us once again on the Megacast. Dr. Smith, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, appreciate you having you on the show, because this is a situation that you have some expertise in, the gun violence side. Unfortunately, also there is that direct connection to Michigan State University, as this has hit directly at home at the at a university that you teach at as well. So for you, given that direct connection, your association with Michigan State University, and this really hitting home, how does the situation for you, as an expert in this field, as someone that studies gun violence and studies the ways that gun violence is approached for prevention, for intervention, and ultimately for change in legislation down the road, how did this hit differently for you?
Well, at a very personal level, I teach in the hallway in Berkey Hall,
Wow.
where the first part of the shooting occurred. Had this shooter chosen a different night of the week, it could very well have been me in my classroom who were there, because I teach a class into the early evening, so you think about kind of close calls and the risks that are all around us. So on the one hand, there's that factor, and it makes me very concerned about my students, because I don't know yet anything about where they were, what their experiences were. I know that a lot of people aren't going to want to go back to Berkey Hall, and MSU is making arrangements to move classes out of there for the rest of this semester. But another part of me, also having looked at a lot of these things, also knows, why should we be immune? Why wouldn't it happen here? With 400 million guns in the hands of civilians, some of whom are responsible gun owners and some of whom are not. Basically, we are all at risk of what someone else might do. So I was shocked, but in a way also not surprised.
And in the wake of these mass shootings, we see it time and time again here in Michigan, here in other places in the United States, a place where this is uniquely a problem. These mass shootings on our school campuses and other public gathering areas, really anywhere at any time in the U.S., there can and there will be a mass shooting. And in these situations, in the immediate aftermath, the conversation almost instantly turns to legislative response, legislative preventative measures that can be taken. And in places that these have been taken, how effective have they been making some of these reforms that we hear pretty commonly, universal background checks, red flag laws, and so on, that have become sort of the buzzwords of speak at this time, thinking about legislative responses?
So, given the pervasiveness of guns throughout the country, it's very hard to think that, there's going to be this law that is going to prevent this thing from happening. I think we think more in terms of the variety of gun violence problems we see. The majority of deaths are from suicides. We see children acquiring firearms and other things. And so legislatively, you want to work at reducing risk and harm where you can. In this particular instance, of course, there's a little bit of a question we don't know. If Michigan had an extreme risk protection order law, otherwise known as a red flag law, where firearms could be removed temporarily from someone who was suffering from crisis or significant problems that showed evidence of potentially harming themselves or others. And I certainly don't know if that would have applied here, but that's the kind of law that in some places might make a difference. And from a social science perspective, it is hard to measure things that don't happen. So in those places that have these laws and they see some lower rate of suicide, for example, we also don't know if mass shootings were prevented, but it's certainly possible because we know of instances in some states where family members were contacting law enforcement. I think my adult child who has mental problems is going to harm people and he has all these guns, and they're in a state where law enforcement has to say to them, there's no mechanism for us to do anything until he causes harm. That's problematic. But I think we want to think about gun violence in all its different dimensions and think about what are the ways we may reduce risk and harm, even knowing that we cannot prevent all of these events, especially random shooting events, from happening.
And that goes to what's often the counterpoint from usually those in more conservative circles politically that say this isn't a gun issue, this is a mental health issue. I'm in the camp personally of it's both. It can be both, and it really should be approached from both angles. How much of a mental health side of things on the legislative side would also be helpful in conjunction to some of these potential gun reforms that we have seen in other places or be proposed in other places and certainly are expected to be proposed here and up for vote in our legislature given its Republican majority, Democratic majority in both chambers pretty soon?
Well, the mental health argument is not irrelevant because we
Yeah.
see some people who, have clinically diagnosable things, but we see other people that go into just an emotional rage that wouldn't be, you know, diagnosable. And, one way just to highlight that, if you look at other countries that do not have the rates of mass shootings that we have, they are just extraordinarily rare events. It isn't because they've solved mental health. It's because you don't have that combination of guns with mental health problems, which really affects us. But if you think in the United States, for example, we don't have universal health care. And we have, in many places, very inadequately funded and accessible mental health treatment programs. And how different might it be if we had universal health care that included mental health care? Again, we won't know unless we do it, but that's something that other countries do have and that we simply lack. So I'm all in favor of increasing our attention and resources to mental health issues and other medical issues, because I think there would be broad benefits for society. But that's not going to cure the problem because we see people who act with guns in a moment of rage that is not based on some diagnosable psychiatric condition.
We're joined on today's program by the board chairman of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, Dr. Chris Smith, who's also a professor of criminal justice at Michigan State University. You can find more information on the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence at michigancoalitiontopreventgunviolence.org. And going back to the academic side of things, as you mentioned, Chris, you are a professor of criminal justice. You have taught at Berkey Hall, one of your classes where this shooting did occur, and teaching students in criminal justice, whether they are aiming to be in law enforcement, or be an attorney, defense, or a prosecuting attorney. Where do you even begin coming back from this to apply what has happened right there at Michigan State University to what these students, or some of these students presumably, may be working on specifically solving after their time at Michigan State?
Well, certainly one big piece of it, as you've covered this week, is from a psychological angle of repair, recovery, and what we've just talked about with mental health issues. That's outside of my area. I'm more about law and policy and the question of how do we produce research that may be useful to tell us what kinds of policies could reduce risk and harm, what research exists, and can we overcome the collision we find on this issue and some other issues where research evidence collides with strongly held ideological beliefs about guns. So I think I'm going to tread a little bit carefully throughout the rest of the semester about this, but I think the discussions that I will have in my classes is to think about what does research evidence tell us and what kinds of things might reduce some aspects of gun violence if they would be put into law. And of course, the other element that I look at is what are the impediments to having these things become law, even when they are supported by research evidence as being something beneficial and having very modest impacts on gun ownership.
You can get involved, Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence.org, and get in on conversations like this and ultimately pushing for action across the board to prevent gun violence here in Michigan and across the board as well. Dr. Smith, before we let you go, anything else that you'd like to say today?
No, but I do appreciate people who have media platforms as you do that are trying to explore and present these issues in a very thoughtful way because it's complex. There's a variety of dimensions about gun violence people need to think about. It's not a simple matter of trying to take people's guns away or colliding with the Second Amendment. So let me just express my gratitude to you and your colleagues around the state and the country who are looking at this in a thoughtful way to try to educate the public. Our goal is to educate the public, and you make a big contribution to this too.
Dr. Smith, appreciate your kind words, and thank you as always for giving us your time.
Thank you.